All right, what do they say? Better late than never. Didn't get my top 25 video out yesterday. However, if you watched Lunch Money last night like you're supposed to, every Monday night at 10 p.m., the live show with me and Pigskin Pete, I at least showed you my top 25 last night on Lunch Money. Just didn't have time to get the video uploaded. So here it is today. Now, just like we always do, I'm going to show you last week's top 25 first, so you have an idea of where I started when I sat down to make this week's top 25. So here you go. Here's last week's top 25 right there, week 6. All right, now we're on to week 7 of the 2025 college football season, so I've got an updated top 25 for you. Falling out of my rankings this week, still looking at last week's here. Washington lost, I dropped them out. LSU got absolutely humiliated, I dropped them out. BYU lost to what I think is a pretty average to below average Notre Dame team, I dropped them out. And Florida State dropped their second game in a row, had to go ahead and drop them out as well. That means there's 4 new teams moving into the top 25 this week. Let's put week 7 up and you can see the new teams. All right, making their way into UNCLELOU's top 25 for week 7 of the 2022 college football season. Making their way in this week, Cincinnati at 25, Illinois at 24, Texas at 20, North Carolina at 23 there. So 4 teams in, 4 teams out. I'm going to do this a little different. I'm going to start at the top this time and work the way down, okay? I say this every single time I do one of these videos, and I still get people that don't listen to these videos. They just fast forward to this screenshot where they see the top 25, and then they ask me a bunch of questions that are answered repeatedly in this video. The top 3 and 4 teams in my ranking, I move up and down every single week based off of how did they do this past weekend. I think there's 3 or 4 teams in college football right now that are really hard to separate no matter what you want to look at. Best wins, overall resume, eye test, strength of schedule, whatever you want to look at. I can make arguments for or against at least 3 teams being number 1, 2 or 3, maybe even 4 teams being numbers 2, 3, or 4. So for that reason, until some of these top teams lose a game, I'm just going on what did you do for me lately, right? How did you look this past weekend? So I'm not going to put week 6 back up, but if you were, last week's top 25, I had Alabama at number 1. That was coming off of a dominating win over Arkansas. Well, this week, Alabama struggled at home against a bad Texas A&M team. Had to survive a last-second play from like the 2-yard line for Texas A&M, which would have won them that game. Alabama did hang on to win. I understand they were without their starting quarterback, Bryce Young. Well, guess what? Texas A&M was without their starting quarterback as well. And breaking news, it's week 7 of the football season. Every single team in America is dealing with injuries in some form or fashion. So am I impressed that Alabama was able to win that game with Jalen Milroe? Well, yeah, in as far as the fact that he's just not very good at throwing the ball, yeah. But Alabama with Jalen Milroe was still like a 24-point favorite in this game. And it was just a little bit too close for me. So the reality is, I bump Alabama down this week. I had Ohio State at number 2 last week. Now, to me, Ohio State has been the most consistently dominant team of the top 3 or 4. And you could maybe even argue that Michigan has been the second most dominant team in terms of neither one of those teams has really had a struggle win. I know Michigan had a 1-score win over Maryland. Maryland's not a terrible team. And if you watch that game, Michigan dominated the entire game. It wasn't like the Georgia game versus Mizzou. In that game, Georgia trailed the entire game until the 4th quarter. Michigan hasn't had anything like that. But anyway, Ohio State went out again this past weekend and just absolutely obliterated their opponent, Michigan State this time. C.J. Stroud had 6 touchdown passes. The guy's just a machine this year. If anybody other than C.J. Stroud wins the Heisman this year, I'll be absolutely shocked. But I moved Ohio State up from 2 to 1 based off this past weekend's performance. Michigan, I left at 3. There are some people pointing to the first half of the Michigan game as reasons to describe that game as kind of a struggle fest for Michigan. I did give Michigan a little bit of a break with the first half of that game against, Indiana. And Michigan had a coach literally collapse on the sideline early in that game. They had to bring the stretcher out for him, carted him off. That has to have had some type of effect on Michigan for the first half. So, yeah, they were tied 10-10, I think it was, with Indiana at halftime. Ended up blowing them away in the second half. I think the final score was 31-10. So I'm not going to punish Michigan for a slow start and a slow first half in that game. I'm left them right where they were. And you can see I have Alabama down to 4. Now, this is not a power rating. I say this every week, and people just don't get it or they don't listen. This is not a power rating. A power rating, it means you think number 1 will beat number 2. Number 2 will beat number 3. Number 3 will beat number 4. Number 4 will beat number 5. Number 20 will beat number 21. Number 21 will beat number 22. A power rating is literally that simple. Generally, it's based off of what the Vegas odds of a game would be. This isn't a power rating. So I'm not suggesting to you that I think Ohio State would beat Georgia, or that I think Michigan would beat Alabama, or even that I think Ohio State would beat Alabama. I'm not suggesting Ohio State wouldn't beat those teams either. The point is, this is not a power rating. This is a ranking based off the criteria I use week to week during the season and over the course of the season to rank teams. It's a combination of a bunch of different things. Eye test, schedule, strength of schedule, impressive wins, good wins, wins over ranked teams. When you get down lower in the list, if you have losses, who did you lose to? How much was the loss? I combine all of those things in my head, and I come up with what I think is a pretty realistic top 25 ranking. It does not mean that I automatically think the 11 team would beat the 15 team. The best example of this in my mind is Texas. I've got Texas at 20. Texas would beat almost every single team ranked ahead of them until you start getting into the top 4 or 5, and then you can have some legitimate conversations. But Texas would beat Syracuse. But Syracuse has 0 losses and Texas has 2. I can't ignore that in a ranking. In a power rating, I can. In a power rating, I'd have Texas in the top 10. I think right now, Texas is one of the 10 best teams in the country. But they've got 2 losses. You have to factor record into a ranking. You don't have to factor record into a power rating. So if you want to make a power rating, go ahead. In my opinion, it's way easier to make a power rating than it is a ranking. I'd do a ranking. So there you go. That's sort of my best explanation. So there's 1 through 4. At Clemson, I've got 5. I moved them up from 6. Clemson has been steadily climbing in my rankings every single week. I was not all that high on Clemson heading into the season. Now, I had them in the top 10, but they were borderline top 10, right? I wasn't impressed with them week 1 against Georgia Tech. They played good in the second half when Georgia Tech wore down, but overall, none of my questions about their quarterback, DJ Ucla, were really answered in the game against Georgia Tech. I didn't think he played well. I didn't think a good game plan was developed for him in week 1. I didn't think the play calling was good in week 1. But since then, there's just no denying the fact that DJ has played better and better and better over the course of the season. Night and day difference between what we saw from him and that Clemson offense last year. They had 2 wins in 2 consecutive weeks, to me, that were pretty impressive. Now, not necessarily this past weekend against a bad Boston College team, but the 2 wins before that, they beat Wake Forest and NC State in back-to-back weeks. Those are 2 teams that are currently ranked in every single top 15 poll or ranking that you look at. AP, coaches, mine. You see I've got NC State and Wake Forest at 14 and 15, even though they both lost to Clemson. So Clemson's got 2 wins over teams currently ranked in the top 15. That's impressive. They've been moving steadily up in my rankings. I have them this week at number 5. I think Georgia's got the best win of any team, the best individual win. And that bears out, again, no matter what ranking you look at, Georgia, whether you've got them at 1, 2, or 3, has a win over a top 12 or 13 team. In my case, I have Oregon at 11. I think they're 12 in the coaches and 11 in the AP. Anyway, they're in the top 12 or 13 of every ranking. Georgia beat them 49-3. So far this football season, that's the most impressive win that any team in the country has, a 49-3 beatdown of a top 12 team. And Clemson's the only team that has 2 wins over 2 top 15 teams. I've got Clemson at 5. Oklahoma State, I've got them at 6. The Big 12 is the most interesting conference in all of college football this year. Maybe it's not the best conference, but it's the most interesting, and it's going to be the most entertaining and the most exciting down the stretch. When you look at all the Power 5 conferences and the odds to win those conferences, you have 1, maybe 2 teams that have way better odds than the rest of the teams in the conference. That's not the case in the Big 12. When you look in the Big 12, there are 4 or 5 teams right now whose odds to win the conference are, within an eyeshadow of each other. Oklahoma State is obviously one of those teams. Them and TCU remain undefeated in the Big 12. Kansas took their first loss this past weekend. Texas with 2 losses already. Oklahoma circling the drain. Baylor already has a couple of losses, but only one of them, I believe, is a Big 12 loss. Or did they lose another game? Anyway, Oklahoma State and TCU right now appear to be the class of the Big 12. And it's going to get very interesting down the stretch. Can Kansas knock either of those off? What about Kansas State, right? They're still just sitting on one loss, I believe. It's going to be a very interesting end of the season in the Big 12. But I've got Oklahoma State at number 6. They beat Texas Tech this past weekend, 41-31. I'm not sure if I mentioned it or not, but Clemson beat Boston College. Did I talk about that? I think I did. 31-3. Got off to a little bit of a slow start. I think it was 10-3 at halftime. Poured it on it. The Clemson Boston College game was very similar to the Michigan Indiana game. Kind of sluggish first halves. Both teams poured it on in the second half. Alabama, of course, survives against Texas A&M. Georgia absolutely road graded Auburn 42-10, and Ohio State, behind 6 touchdown passes from C.J. Stroud, beat Michigan State 49-20. Alabama, of course, plays on the road at Tennessee this week. You see, I've got them at number 9, another team that keeps moving up in my rankings. I had them unranked to start the season. I wanted to see if they could win on the road at Pitt. They did. I ranked Tennessee at that point. They've been ranked every week since then. They've been moving up and up and up and up and up. Cracked the top 10 last week. At number 9 this week, we'll talk more about them in a second, but them in Alabama. Alabama at Tennessee, of course, one of the biggest games of the week. Michigan plays Penn State. 2 top 10 matchups this week. Alabama, Tennessee, Michigan, Penn State. Home game for Michigan and Tennessee in those 2 games. And Oklahoma State, they beat Texas Tech 41-31. They play TCU. What a huge game. Huge game. Oklahoma State and TCU. See, I've got TCU at 12. Those are the 2 unbeaten teams in the Big 12. That's going to be a great game. Home game for TCU. Should be a really, really good one. Southern Cal, number 7. Might be one of the most difficult teams to figure out right now, but it's going to start to sort itself out in the Pac-12 as well. What did Southern Cal do this past weekend? They beat Washington State 30-14. This week, though, they play on the road at Utah, a desperate Utah team that really, really needs a win. Utah took that loss early in the season to Florida, and that sort of put them behind the 8 ball in terms of making the playoffs. They pretty much had to run the table the rest of the way if they wanted to get in. That, of course, hasn't happened. You can see I've got Utah all the way down at number 21. They lost this past weekend to a surprisingly good UCLA team, which we'll talk about in a second. But this Southern Cal game this weekend is going to be a really, really good one. At number 20, Utah back against the wall. They can still technically win the Pac-12, right? Because only one of their losses is a conference loss. So this is going to be like an empty-the-chamber game for Utah. And I think Southern Cal's toughest test of the season by far, having to go on the road to Utah. Not an easy place to play, but I've got Southern Cal at 7. Penn State, I've got at 8. They were off this past week. They didn't play, so not a lot of people talking about them last week or over the weekend. But, of course, they've got the huge matchup coming up this weekend on the road at Michigan. And then they got to turn around and play, I believe it's Minnesota and then Penn State. 3 games in a row. Ohio State. So the next 3 games for Penn State are the 3 best teams, or 3 of the 4 best teams in the entire Big Ten, right? Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio State, just an absolute gauntlet coming up for Penn State. They're about a touchdown underdog this week on the road at Michigan. Again, one of 2 top 10 matchups that we have this weekend in college football, the other being Alabama and Tennessee. Tennessee, like I mentioned, at number 9, absolutely destroyed LSU. The only thing holding Tennessee back right now from being ranked ahead of some of these other teams, I think, is maybe some impressive wins and recency bias, right? Tennessee's been bad for so long. People kind of keep wanting them to prove themselves over and over again. And I even agree it's not necessarily fair that we look at it that way. But the reality is Tennessee's got a win on the road in overtime at Pitt that is starting to look worse and worse every week. The home win against Florida, although it was a big win for Tennessee as a program and sort of as a mindset boost for Tennessee because they just lost so many games to Florida in the last 20 years. I don't think it's really considered that impressive of a win nationally, right? Florida's not a very good team. And Tennessee struggled in that game, especially on defense. In fact, that's probably the worst game Tennessee's defense has played was at home against Florida. They gave up, I think, 35 points or something to Florida, made Anthony Richardson look like a Heisman contender. That defense is going to have to play a lot better this week if they're going to beat Alabama. But people are going to be mad. I have Tennessee at 9. It really doesn't matter to me. I wouldn't do these videos if people getting mad bothered me. Beat Alabama. Then every poll in America, every ranking in America is going to have you in the top 5, including mine if you beat Alabama. So it really doesn't matter where I have you at this week. Same thing for Penn State. If you think Penn State or Tennessee are undervalued in this poll, this ranking, or any poll or any ranking, great. Both these teams have an opportunity to beat a top 4 team this weekend. So if Tennessee's a top 5 team, they'll beat Alabama at home. I'll have a prediction video on that coming out this week as well. Number 10, I've got number 10, I've got Ole Miss. I flip-flop Tennessee and Ole Miss. If you just look at the final score, yeah, Ole Miss handled Vandy. Final score ended up being something like 52-28. But Ole Miss was losing, in the first half. I believe they were still losing at halftime. Poured it on in the second half. But overall, not one of the better games that Ole Miss has played this year. They do have a fun ground game, though. It's fun to watch those running backs. But overall, this past weekend, I thought what Tennessee did was just demolishing LSU on the road. Was a little bit more impressive than what Ole Miss did to a bad Vandy team, so I flip-flopped those two. I felt like Tennessee deserved to be moved up for the performance they put on in Baton Rouge. So that's the top 10. Moving on now, 11 through 15. Of course, I've got Oregon coming in at number 11, up one spot from last week where I had them at 12. I had Kentucky at 11 last week, so I really had no choice but to move Oregon up because Kentucky took another loss this past weekend. So I've got Oregon at 11. They beat Arizona 49-22. Oregon is averaging something like 50 points a game since week 1 when they played Georgia. People forgot about Oregon after that week 1 game. They got absolutely destroyed 49-3 in Atlanta by UJ, and people just kind of wrote them off. They've been rolling. And when people start talking about the Pac-12, they talk, of course, about Southern Cal with Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams in that offense, and they're undefeated and in the top 10. They're talking about UCLA and their resurgence under Chip Kelly and how good the quarterback DTR is playing there and the big win they just had over Utah. You don't hear a lot of people talking about Oregon, and it's possible Oregon's the best team in the Pac-12. Now, we're going to find out because a lot of these teams play each other, and even though there are technically still divisions in the Pac-12, that's not how they choose the Pac-12 title game. So we're going to get the 2 best teams at the end of the year out of the Pac-12 to play in a Pac-12 title game, and right now, Oregon is in the mix. Yes, they have a loss to Georgia. That's not a conference loss. So they've got the same conference record as Southern Cal and UCLA, right? It's going to be a hell of an ending to the regular season in both the Big 12 and the Pac-12. Oregon's off this coming up week, so they have a bye week. I've got TCU at 12, and I'm going to be honest, I've been really impressed with TCU over the last few weeks. They destroyed Oklahoma a couple of weeks ago. Thought they might have a little bit of a letdown this week. Didn't really happen. They beat an previously undefeated Kansas team 38-31 in what might have been the best game of the weekend this past weekend. So TCU remains undefeated. Another fun team to watch with a first-year head coach. It's off to a really, really fast start. TCU is probably headed inside of the top 10 if they can beat Oklahoma State this coming up weekend. It's just going to be a great game. The Pac-12 and the Big 12, if you stopped paying attention to the Pac-12 or the Big 12 over the last couple of years, you really need to start paying attention to it again this year. If you're a college football fan, you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not watching some of the biggest games of the week every week within the Pac-12 and the Big 12. It's entertaining football this year. You've got the Southern Cal-Utah game coming up in the Pac-12, a huge, huge game. And then you've got TCU and Oklahoma State, 2 undefeated teams. That's 3 games this weekend involving top 12 teams where both teams are undefeated, right? TCU and Oklahoma State. That game's at TCU, I believe, as well. So TCU and Oklahoma State, Alabama and Tennessee also undefeated, Michigan and Penn State also undefeated. So you have got some huge games this weekend that are going to impact not only division and conference races, but have college football playoff implications for down the road as well. I don't know. This is probably the best week of games of the season so far, at least in terms of highly ranked matchups. At 13, I've got UCLA, another undefeated team who looked good this past weekend, beat Utah 42-32. An impressive win where UCLA looked really, really good. What a shame that the fans won't show up to watch UCLA play. I know it's become almost a joke now, a punchline about the attendance in the Pac-12 and at UCLA. It's really, really sad what's going on and the lack of support that UCLA is getting from the students, apparently, and just the fans at large that live in the greater Los Angeles area that won't come out and support this team. A legitimate top 15 team and a team that has a chance to move into the top 10 here at some point over the next couple of weeks. But I've got UCLA this week at 13 after that big win over Utah, 42-32. They now get a bye week to prepare for the second half of their season. Talked about NC State and Wake Forest a little bit already, but I've got them at 14 and 15. NC State had what I thought was an impressive win. Now, they didn't look great, but they beat a pretty good Florida State team this past weekend, 19-17, after coming off a demoralizing loss the week before to Clemson, where I was worried NC State would have a letdown heading into this Florida State game because of the loss to Clemson. Didn't happen. Well, it might have happened, but it didn't cost them the game. They found a way to win 19-17. And then they play an undefeated Syracuse team, which just sounds weird to say, undefeated Syracuse. This coming week on the road at Syracuse could be an interesting game. NC State versus Syracuse. And then I've got Wake Forest at 15. They beat Army 45-10. They have a bye week next week to get ready for the second half of their schedule. Mississippi State at 16 might be the most underrated team in my ranking. They look pretty good to me. That offense is clicking with Mike Leach, and the defense is playing better, I think, than they get credit for, and definitely better than what I thought they would be heading into the season. But they absolutely destroyed Arkansas 40-17. Now, Arkansas didn't have KJ Jefferson, but putting up 40 on Arkansas is no easy task, and Mississippi State did it, and they looked good doing it. This week, they travel and play a Kentucky team that is really reeling after taking a couple of losses in a row. Will Levis didn't play last week. We'll see if he comes back this week. But big game this week, Mississippi State on the road at Kentucky, who you can see I've got at number 22. Kansas, I've got at 17. I didn't drop them. I didn't drop Kansas not one bit. They lost this past weekend. It was their first loss of the season, right? They lost to an undefeated TCU team. I didn't feel like they deserved to drop because of that. And I believe the AP poll kept them the same as well. But they lost 38-31 against a really, really good TCU team. So Kansas no longer undefeated, but they're still 5-1. They're still going to have the best year they've had in over a decade. And technically still in the race to participate or win the Big 12 title game, right? I've got their neighbor, Kansas State, coming in at number 18. They beat Iowa State 10-9 in one of the ugliest, most boring games you'll ever see. If you watched that game, I'm sorry. It was a complete waste of time. But Kansas State did win, so they're still just sitting on the one loss as well, and no conference losses. So when it comes to the Big 12 standings, they've got the same record as TCU and Oklahoma State. 0 losses in the conference. They're sitting there at number 18. They lost to Tulsa earlier in the year. 19, I've got Syracuse, the lowest rated undefeated team on my list. I've watched Syracuse play twice this year. They're just not very good. So there's people that wanted to argue with me last week because I said I take record into account when I come up with my rankings. And they said, well, you're being a hypocrite because if you take record into account, why is Syracuse 19? Because record's not the only thing I take into account. Again, which I explain in painstaking detail on a third grade level every single time I do one of these videos. So the only reason I have Syracuse at 19 is because they're undefeated, okay? If they had even one loss, they'd be nowhere near my top 25. I don't think they're one of the 25 best teams in the country. I don't. But the reality is they're undefeated halfway through the season. That's part of what I use to determine these rankings. But do you think Syracuse would beat Kansas? Do you think they would beat Mississippi State or Wake Forest? What about UCLA or TCU? Do you think Syracuse would beat Texas? What about Utah? What about North Carolina? What about Illinois, Cincinnati? There's a lot of teams that would beat Syracuse, but Syracuse is undefeated. I've got them at 19. I've got Texas at 20, and you got to feel bad for the Texas fans. Texas is probably one of the 10 best teams in the country right now, and I think you can make a legitimate argument and make a legitimate case that had Quinn Ewers not been hurt in the Alabama game, Texas would be undefeated and ranked in the top 4 right now. I think you can legitimately make that argument. Now, we don't live in the if world, right? The reality is he did get hurt in the Alabama game, and they did lose. They then lost to Texas Tech. I know it was without Quinn Ewers, and if they played Texas Tech again with Quinn Ewers, I'm confident they would beat them. You can't go back in time and unwrite or rewrite history. Again, if this was a power rating, I'd have Texas in the top 10. I think they'd beat some of these top 10 teams, maybe half of them, right? But this isn't a power rating. This is a ranking, and you can't ignore a team's record. Texas has the same number of available scholarships as every other team in the country, right? Alabama went out and played this past weekend with a backup quarterback and won. We see teams do it all the time. Georgia won a national title last year with a backup quarterback. So I feel bad for Texas because I feel like as good as this year is going, it could have been better, and Texas fans have been waiting for that for a long time. Unfortunately, the football gods dealt you a bad hand in week 2 with the Quinn Ewers injury, and it's kind of just one of those it is what it is type of deals. You do have the 2 losses, and I have to take that into account when I'm ranking teams. But do I think UCLA would beat Texas? No. Do I think Ole Miss would beat Texas? Probably not. I mean, I could go through the list here. Again, if this was a power rating, I would have Texas much higher. It's not a power rating. It's a ranking, and I've got Texas at number 20. They can still win the Big 12, by the way. The Alabama loss doesn't count towards that, so they only have one conference loss. If they win out, they're going to be in the Big 12 title game. No question about it. I dropped Utah all the way down to number 21. Disappointing loss for Utah in that they had serious playoff expectations heading into the season. Won the Pac-12 last year. Great Rose Bowl game against Ohio State. Cam Rising decides to come back for his 100th year or whatever it is. And once you win your conference and make a New Year's Six game, there's only really one level up you can go, and that's playoffs. And, Utah started the season out ranked in the top 10 for a lot of people. Had that opening week loss against Florida. Turn around this past weekend and lose to UCLA. And unfortunately, with 2 losses, that pretty much eliminates Utah from any playoff consideration. Now, they still could technically run the table, make it to the Pac-12 title game, win the Pac-12 title again with, let's say, an 11-2 overall record and a Pac-12 title, and again make a really big New Year's Six game. But in terms of making the playoffs, I think it's over for Utah with the 2 losses here halfway through the season. I've got them at number 21. Kentucky, I dropped them significantly as well. 11 spots. I had Kentucky at 11, dropped them all the way to 22. Again, I get it that Will Levis didn't play, and that's a shame for Kentucky fans because Kentucky's another team like Utah who had some really, really high expectations coming into the season. Maybe not quite as high as Utah, but Kentucky had hopes maybe of competing for the East, possibly making it to the SEC championship game, possibly making a New Year's Six bowl. I feel like all of those things are gone now for Kentucky when you consider the games they've already lost plus the games they have upcoming. And Will Levis was out, and that's horrible. But again, we're in week 6, week 7 of the college football season. Every single team is dealing with injuries. And the reality is South Carolina is not a very good team. And minus 1 player on offense, you just looked absolutely horrendous. It reminded me of watching Kentucky before they got Will Levis, right? When they couldn't complete a pass to save their life. It was hard to watch offensively. Now, I thought maybe Kentucky could still win this game with their running game. Kavosiey Smoke, Chris Rodriguez being back now for a couple of weeks. Didn't happen. South Carolina went out and played a good game on the road at Kentucky and handed Kentucky their second conference loss of the season and their second loss in a row. Not good for Kentucky based on what some of their fans were looking forward to for this year. I've got North Carolina back in at number 23. It seems like all people have done is crap on North Carolina because they keep giving up so many points, which, look, it's true. Their defense is terrible. But they only have 1 loss. At this point in the season, it's getting hard to find 1-loss teams, but North Carolina sitting there with just the 1 loss. Are they ranked in the AP? No. They were the next team in the AP ranking this past week. So they didn't get ranked in the AP top 25, but they're the first team in others receiving votes. So they came pretty close. But they're still just sitting on the 1 loss. They beat Miami this past weekend. I moved them back into the top 25 at number 23. Illinois making a debut in the UNCLELOU top 25. Again, another team that sort of has come out of nowhere, 5-1. Beat Iowa in look, 9-6. I don't know what's going on with some of these games in the Midwest, but this was another game that, I'd rather have my toenails ripped off slowly than been forced to watch it. But Illinois continues to win. They beat Iowa 9-6. Big game coming up for them against Minnesota. And Muhammad Ibrahim is expected to be back this week for Minnesota. If that's the case, Minnesota needs to win that game. See if they can get themselves back in the top 25. They're sitting on the 1 loss too. Minnesota is. And a group of 5 team, Cincinnati, cracking the UNCLELOU top 25 rankings. You know what? Turns out I was a little bit wrong about Cincinnati. Made the playoffs last year. I felt like they were going to take a significant step back this year. And I don't mean, not just not make the playoffs. Of course, they were never going to make the playoffs this year. I questioned if they would even be ranked at all this year. I just felt like they lost too much, and this would be sort of like maybe an 8-4 type of year, and they wouldn't even be ranked. But it looks like, once again, they might be the best group of 5 team in the country. They're the only group of 5 team I've got ranked. I thought Houston would be the best group of 5 team in the country this year. Boy, they've been borderline terrible. But Cincinnati gets another win this past weekend against South Florida, 28-24. They're off this coming week. They have their bye week. There you go. The UNCLELOU Top 25 for Week 7 of the 2022 college football season. Make sure you let me know down below where you think I got wrong. And have a good morning.